Now, as we're working our way up through the airspace classes, let's take a closer look at the first one where we have to talk with a controller, Class D airspace. Now, when you see Class D airspace, think dialogue. Where there's Class D airspace, that means there's a control tower on the field, and you must establish two-way communications with them before you enter their airspace. Now, what does it mean when you've established, how do you know when you've established two-way communications? Well, if you call up a controller and say, this is Cessna 359er Echo Sierra, and he says, Cessna 359er Echo Sierra, stand by, you have established two-way communications. The controller has called you by name, so to speak, and you can go ahead and enter the Class D or Delta airspace. Now, if that controller is very, very busy and he really doesn't want to take time to deal with you right now, he might say something like, aircraft calling, stand by. This time, as you can guess, you have not established communications. You were not called by name, and so you cannot enter that Class D airspace. But suppose instead that the controller said, Cessna 359er Echo Sierra, stand by and remain clear of the Class Delta airspace. You have established two-way communications because the controller has called you by name, but now you have a specific ATC instruction to stay out of that airspace, and you should not operate contrary to an ATC instruction unless you have an emergency. Class D or Delta airspace, where you must have a dialogue, is shown on an aeronautical chart with a blue dashed line around that area. Now, because Class D or Delta airspace tells you there is a control tower on the field, the airport symbol will also be shown in blue. Class D airspace extends controlled airspace all the way down to the ground at airports that have a control tower at them. And ATC will provide separation service between IFR airplanes all the way to the ground. Now, when is this Class D airspace in effect? Anytime the associated control tower is in operation. If the control tower operator quits for the evening, turns out the lights and shuts the door and goes home, the Class D airspace goes away because the control tower will no longer be in operation. The real purpose of Class D or dialogue airspace is to keep two airplanes from running into each other on the ground. That's why you need a clearance from the tower before you take off or land. Now, Class D airspace also provides what they call a safe, orderly, and expeditious flow of traffic on and near the airport. But what it does not do is it does not separate VFR aircraft in the air. For instance, suppose you call the tower controller and he says to report downwind. Well, there's a tendency to think that the tower provides separation services from that time on. And that's just not correct. The only separation service the tower provides is to keep airplanes apart on the runway. If you're not on the runway, you are not getting separation service. So you are responsible for looking out the window to make sure you do not run into anyone else. Now, what the tower does provide is advisories. If they know of any conflicting traffic, they'll tell you about it. They'll give you traffic alerts when they think you're dangerously close to another aircraft, to terrain, or to obstructions. And they will also sequence aircraft to the runway to get you all lined up in order, and they will provide separation on the runway, but not in the air. Now, there are some different shapes of Class D or Delta airspace, but the standard shape is a circle around the airport that has a radius of 4.4 nautical miles. And that works out, by the way, to 5 statute miles. There can be extension to the Class Delta airspace from time to time. We've got a couple here. when they're needed to help keep IFR approaches in controlled airspace. Now, Class D airspace starts at the surface, and it usually goes up to and including 2,500 feet above the airport elevation. Now, what the FAA does is converts that AGL altitude to an MSL altitude and then rounds it up to the nearest 100 feet. But there are variations occasionally in that altitude. So to find out exactly what the top of Class Delta airspace is, look at the number inside the square, inside that Class Delta airspace. And the top of the Class D airspace here is 2,500 feet MSL. Now, sometimes you'll see a minus sign in front of the altitude. Like here, the minus sign means that the Class D airspace goes up to but does not include the elevation shown. So this Class D airspace tops out at 2,499.99 feet MSL. It goes up to but does not include 2,500 feet. And the reason for that generally is that there's some kind of overlying airspace with a floor of 2,500 feet as there is here. That's why this airspace does not include 2,500 feet MSL. Now, as we said earlier, the standard shape of Class D airspace is a circular area, occasionally with some extensions. If those extensions go out more than 2 nautical miles from the circular area, like they do here and down here, then they will be designated as a Class E surface area rather than Class D. And they'll be shown with magenta dashed lines like here, rather than blue dashed lines. Now, to a VFR pilot flying along, what that means is you do not have to establish two-way communications to fly in this airspace with a magenta dashed line around it, because it's Class E airspace, not Class D, and in E airspace, no dialogue is required. Now, how do you know when you have to talk to the control tower? Well, the answer is anytime you're going to fly across this blue dashed line below the MSL altitude shown for the top of the airspace, you have to give the tower a call. Even if you just want to fly through the area and not land, you still have to call them. If you have any doubt in your mind, well, give them a call. They won't mind at all. Now let's assume you have Class D airspace with a second airport inside the Class D area. Here's the primary airport, but assume you want to land at the secondary airport over here. You must call ATC before entering that Class D airspace, even if you're landing at a secondary airport instead of the primary airport. Aha, you say. How about if you're taking off from the secondary airport and you can't reach them on the radio from the ground? Well, when you're taking off from that secondary airport, you should call the tower at the primary airport as soon as you can after you're airborne. Now, what are the requirements to fly inside Class Delta airspace? Well, you have to have a communications radio so that you can establish two-way communications, and that's all. Now, we said earlier that Class D airspace only exists when the associated control tower is in operation. And we also said that when the controller closes down the tower, turns out the lights, shuts the door, and goes home, Class D airspace no longer exists. So what happens to the airspace? Well, if weather reporting service is still available, even if it's automatic weather reporting, then the Class D turns into a Class E surface area. You can actually think of these blue dashed lines turning into magenta dashed lines, and then you have a Class E surface area. Now, if no official weather reporting exists, then the Class D airspace completely goes away, leaving Class G airspace at the surface. So when you see Class D airspace, think dialogue, because two-way communication with air traffic control is required in Class Delta airspace.